So, I just graduated with my BS in physics, and what I want to do today is give you 10 tips that I think will help with your physics journey, regardless of how far along you are, whether you're a freshman or a senior or wherever. So, the first tip is to show up to class and sit front and center, and of course, take good notes. So, this seems a little obvious, but you'd actually be surprised how many people, even upperclassmen, just don't go to class. I had several senior level courses that had maybe 20, 30 people enrolled, yet only about 5 people would show up to lecture. And I do get it. There are some lectures that aren't as useful as others, and you might be like me and you learn best by going through the textbook and working examples. But even if you are that person, and even if the lectures are subpar, you likely are still learning something by going to class, even if it's not obvious right away. And if nothing else, you know where the professor expects you to be in the textbook when you do go through and cover the material on your own. So sitting front and center is optional, and that's not always possible, especially if you have, say, another class beforehand. But if you can do it, it is ideal. Just that way you're in the professor's range. You can see everything they're writing on the chalkboard. They can see you. If you can do it, you should. I would also recommend asking 1 or 2 questions per class to show that you are taking in the material and you're trying to process it to another step. Too many questions could take the class off course, and you don't want to do that. You don't want to hinder the lecture in any way. You don't want to hinder anyone else's ability to learn. I think 1 to 2 questions per class for like a hour-long course is pretty ideal. In addition, I wouldn't ask any questions that are super lengthy or detailed. Something that's kind of abstracts where you are now. I wouldn't ask an example problem. I wouldn't ask a homework problem. I would save that for what I'll explain in tip 2. But one last thing I want to mention about this, and this is kind of my last pitch to show up to class, is if you find yourself in your last year or semester and you're going to apply to graduate schools, ideally you'll want your letters of rec to come from people who can write about your research experience, but there's a good chance you'll need at least 1 or 2 letters of rec from someone else because maybe you didn't have as much research experience as you would have liked. In which case, it's going to be nice to have a professor who can, at the very least, recognize you, knows you showed up, knows you worked hard, knows you'll ask good questions. That's going to be a better letter of rec than somebody who simply says, yeah, they were in my class and they did well in it. So that's something to consider. Now, tip 2 is to go to office hours. So a lot of what I said about tip number 1 can be applied to this. The professors also get to know you. It'll help with the letter of rec. But there's one big benefit to going to office hours, and that is you can ask very specific questions here. You can ask questions regarding a homework problem. I think this is totally appropriate. You can ask about a book problem, an example problem, what be it, and this is probably a more appropriate place to ask than in a lecture when they're kind of working against the clock. So office hours, again, you won't always be able to go to them. Sometimes they'll conflict. But what I found is if you reach out to a professor, most of them are willing to make time, even outside of office hours, to meet with you. So I highly recommend taking advantage of that. Tip number 3 is to form study groups. And I know some people are shy. They're not excited about asking and talking to people about this. But if you ask people in a course or you message them on Canvas, you're almost certainly going to get at least 3 or 4 people that are very willing to form a study group with you. It's a great way to learn. It's a great way to check if your understanding is up to par with your peers. They can kind of keep you up to date on things. You can keep them up to date on things. You just work together, and it's really good. It's one of the best things you can do to help your grade, in my opinion, how well you're doing in class. And some people say that You should only have one other study partner. I've done anywhere between 1 to 4. And what I'll say is the amount of people in your study group is not as important as the personalities of the people in your study group. And the personalities traits that I think make someone a very good study buddy is they're a good listener. They'll listen to what you have to say. They're calm. They don't have an ego problem, so they don't belittle you if you don't get something right. And at the same time, they're willing to question things, including ideas you have. So you don't want a yes man. You don't want someone that's just going to say, yeah, that looks good. You want somebody who will look, listen, hear what you're saying, and say, the only thing about this is this part is kind of tripping me up. And I'm not sure inside of this that this would work with your idea. And then at the same time, you have to be willing to also let your ego go and say, that's a very good point. I think we should look elsewhere. So I think the personalities, I mean, if you had like 10 people, that's probably way too much. But when I had 4 people in my study group, I thought it was pretty effective. Last semester, I only had 1 person, and it went very well. I will say with 1 person, though, there were a few times where he and I would kind of just spin our wheels a little bit. We wouldn't make as much progress as I feel we could if we maybe had a third person to bounce ideas off of. So maybe a group of 3 people would be ideal. I feel 3 people would be good in the sense that they all have different strengths and could contribute to the problems, but not so much that it's overwhelming. And maybe the most important thing to do in your study group, and this will also tie into the next tip, is to not just look stuff up. And I'm going to tie that in. I'll actually just go to tip number 4, which was going to be work as many problems as possible without looking them up. So the dirty little secret is you can find solution manuals to 99% of the homework assignments you'll be given in your college career online. That being said, don't do it because you're going to find yourself in a lot of trouble when you open up an exam and it's nothing like what you had, what you've done before. So you really want to make an honest try at the problems. I would still recommend, this is probably not something a professor or the university would recommend, I would still download the solution manual and I would still use it to check your work. I would not use it as a way to do your homework though. Use it to check your work. You can try to use it to understand the problem a little bit better, but don't be dependent on a solution manual is what I would say. It'll be really nice in the moment, but come exam time, it's not going to be good. And you don't want your study group doing that either. Okay? So tip number 5 is challenge yourself with hard classes. A lot of people don't do this. They want maybe a slightly more relaxed semester. I understand that. I've done that before. But once you're done, you'll be grateful that you challenge yourself. And grad schools will like that. There were a few times that I did try to challenge myself, and I'm glad I did. There were a few times where I took a lighter semester than I need to, and I regret it. Whether you're taking more math classes or computer science classes or graduate courses or chemistry courses, any higher level courses beyond what is necessary, taking those will still look good on a transcript. And a lot of times you'll find there's use in it in your physics courses. So if you took a bunch of advanced math courses, you'll likely find that it will be helpful in your physics courses, even if you didn't need it to graduate. So it's going to help you, and it'll look good if you decide to apply to graduate school. Tip number 6 is research as early as possible. This is very important because if you do apply to graduate school, this is probably the most important thing they're looking at is how well of a researcher you are. So if you can get started as early as possible, do it. Even if you don't feel you'll be at all any use to any sort of research team, that's how I felt, still do it because you're never really going to be useful for the research team at first. So I would still recommend getting as much research as possible. As you do the research, you'll feel more comfortable with it. My 7th tip is to get involved with clubs, organizations, the Society for Physics Students. Get involved as much as you can because you get to meet cool people, number one, which is always good. But you also get to network. You get to usually see professors. What we had is professors would come in and talk about their research, and you would get a chance to ask them questions, and potentially you could do research with that professor at some point. So this is a great opportunity to really get to meet professors and faculty. You can learn what type of research you're interested in this way. A lot of times there'll be upperclassmen there that you can ask questions to. They've kind of experienced it, so they can give you advice. I think this is really, really good, and I really recommend joining if at all possible. The next thing I would say is for tip number 8 is take math classes early and often. So the reason you want to take it early is because after you've been exposed to these math classes, the math in your physics courses will not look as bad, or at least you'll know where a lot of this stuff is coming from. If you take the physics class first and then the math class, I mean, you would have still seen it, so I guess it'll help in your math courses a little bit, but if you really want to do physics and you want to understand the physics, take math first. And in addition to taking it early, take as much as you can. So Calc 1 through 3, differential equations, linear algebra, PDEs, complex functions, abstract algebra, Fourier. There's a lot of stuff you can take. And really, you should also consider, getting a minor in math or even double majoring. It'll just be very, very useful. It'll make your physics courses easier. It'll also help if you are interested at all in getting into theory for research. With theory, math is more important than experimental physics. Tip number 9 is learn to code. This will help a lot with research. It's probably the single most important skill you can bring to a research table. If you can code really well, you'll be able to contribute. This is another thing. You could also consider minoring or double majoring in computer science because it's that useful. It probably won't be as useful in the actual courses you take, but it'll be very useful in research. So if research is something you want to do, and I don't think I mentioned this in the research tip, but research is great for grad school, but it's also something you could put on your resume. So if you do choose to get a job somewhere, having research experience still looks good. So it's a good thing to do as an undergrad if you can. It keeps your options open. It only helps you. Definitely try to do that. And coding will help you with research. Tip number 10, basically be comfortable not understanding stuff right away. It's okay to not know something. It's okay to not understand an entire lecture. It's okay to be confused. You kind of have to let ego die if that's a problem, and I do think it's a problem in STEM. I'm not saying specifically you it's a problem, but in STEM there is, in my opinion, an issue with ego, and a lot of people don't like to be wrong, but it's okay to be wrong, and it's okay to not know stuff. In fact, by accepting that you don't know and acknowledging you don't know and working towards knowing, you can actually get better and you can understand more and learn more. So if ego is a problem, that's definitely something you want to let go before really getting into physics. And if ego is not a problem, just be comfortable if you don't understand something. Some people might get anxiety over the fact that I haven't understood a lecture in like the last 3 weeks. There's been semesters where I've hardly understood any lecture all semester with the exceptions of a handful. And that's okay. You'll eventually, I think, build the confidence to know, once I go through this, I'll go through the textbook, I'll reread my notes, I'll work problems, it will make sense eventually. And as long as you have that mindset and you're willing to work to make it happen, it probably will, and it'll all work out in the end. So those were my 10 tips. Those are just mine from my experience as an undergraduate. I think it's helpful for most people. If you have any tips, leave them in the comments, let me know. And please like and subscribe because it helps my channel out a lot. All right, thank you guys.